Hey everybody, it's Scott again from Oak Ridge Community Church. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Life Minutes. We've been going through the book of Proverbs, looking at what it had to say about characteristics of certain people. The first week we talked about the naive person, the person that wants to walk through life with blinders on. Usually that's a choice they make. They would prefer to think the less they know, the better off they are, and we explain how that's not necessarily the case. Last week we talked about the person that is known as the scorner or the scoffer, but in modern vernacular, it's a person that spends their life just ripping other people to shreds with the words they say, ridiculing them, putting them down, and mocking them. Well, today we're going to talk about a third type of person that Proverbs talks about. Next week we'll wrap it up with learning how to be a wise person, which everyone watching this video, that should be our desire, to be a person of wisdom. In the book of Proverbs, there's a word used that to describe a lazy person. Some translations have the word lazy. Some translations have the word sluggard. Now, we're not talking about taking time to rest and recharge. We are talking about people who are just plain lazy when it comes to life. Frank Tiger says some people would do anything to be able to do nothing. Stuart Briscoe wrote a book called When the Going Gets Tough. I love what Briscoe writes and has to say about a lot of things. But if we could add to this, if this was a book about the lazy person, it would say when the going gets tough, the lazy quit. Proverbs doesn't have anything good to say about the person who chooses to be lazy. In fact, the word that is translated in Proverbs, from which we get the idea of a lazy person, describes someone who's a sluggard, as we mentioned. It's in fact more than just being lazy. It's a person who is often irresponsible. And because they're lazy, they're irresponsible. They just don't fulfill obligations. They don't do what they're supposed to do. There are, at minimum, 3 marks that we want to look at that Proverbs tells us about regarding a lazy person. Maybe you know someone who is like this. The first thing that Proverbs tells us is that a lazy person will rationalize why they're the way they are, and they are often the kings of procrastination. Having said that, please remember this. Not all procrastinators are lazy people. We want to make that clear, all right? They're not. But many lazy people, by nature, because they're irresponsible, put stuff off and often pay the price for being very lazy. But not every person who procrastinates is a lazy person. Please remember that. Proverbs 6:9 says, "How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep?" And then it goes on in verse 11. Solomon writes, "Poverty comes upon the sluggard like a robber." In other words, they don't have a lot of things they would want because they don't want to work for it. They don't want to earn it. So they rationalize, they come up and make excuses for putting things off. In fact, Proverbs talks about in chapter 26 that a sluggard will say in the ancient world, well, I don't want to go out and do my job because there might be a lion in the streets of the city. So that he uses his imagination to come up with an excuse to be lazy. And lazy people have a tendency to do that. They rationalize away their laziness. Proverbs doesn't give them any wiggle room in that, but that's what they do. A second point to be made about lazy people is this: they're undependable. Listen to the words of Proverbs chapter 13, verse 4. The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. The lazy person desires stuff. They want things. They just don't have it because they're lazy, or they expect somebody else to give it to them. But the person who is diligent, the person who works, who earns their keep, gets things because they've earned it. You cannot depend on a lazy person to help get stuff done. If you're looking for help on a project and you know somebody who by nature is lazy, you don't ask them to help. Unless you're wanting to ride them and be on them constantly, you look for a person that you know can be counted on and depended upon to get things done. So they're undependable. They rationalize away their laziness. And Proverbs tells us a third thing about them is they're easily pulled away from what they're to do. Listen to what Proverbs 10 says, verse 26, and I'll explain it. Like vinegar to the teeth, smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. What in the world does Solomon mean? Well, vinegar wasn't good for the teeth, and it's not good for the teeth. It softens them. Everyone knows smoke's not good for the eyes. And so what Solomon is saying is just like vinegar's bad for you, just like smoke's bad for you, a lazy person cannot be counted on to be dependable. Okay? In other words, just like these things aren't good for you, don't give a lazy person a job. Send them to the store, they get sidetracked. Give them a message to give to someone. They don't simply forget to give the message, which we've probably all done at one time or another, not on purpose, but it happens. But it's not a priority in their life. So you pass on something to them and say, hey, can you go tell somebody this or go give them this? It's just not important. The errand's not going to get done. The message isn't going to be passed along. Just don't give important stuff to a lazy person. As I might have mentioned at the beginning, this idea of being a lazy person is not seen in a positive light in the book of Proverbs. So what do you do? How do you help a person who wants to be the perpetual, lifelong couch potato? What do you do with them? Well, the first thing is this, that they need to understand that unresolved problems in their own life. In other words, maybe they're in a situation they're in because of their laziness. They're in that because of decisions they've made. Maybe they're financially in bad shape because they're lazy when it comes to work. Sometimes it takes the pressures of a situation to make a lazy person want to change. They need to see that maybe the problem they're having is because of their, laziness. And we need to remind them of that. We need to say, hey, look, you know what? Maybe you don't have what you want because you're not willing to earn it. And so sometimes laziness is challenged because a person gets in a situation in which they put themselves in because they're, a sluggard, if we could put it that way, or they just don't get stuff done. And you can use that opportunity to encourage them that maybe it's time for a change. A second way to encourage a lazy person is to share with them what is the positives of being diligent. And that you can have things, or life can be better when you're not lazy. It's interesting that in Proverbs chapter 6, Solomon uses the little insect, the ant, to challenge the sluggard. He says, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Solomon uses the diligent, hard-working ant as an illustration of getting things done. The ant doesn't need to be prodded to do what they do. An ant nest is a place of activity. Yes, it comes naturally to the ant. That's part of the point of the proverb. But he takes that and he says, look how hardworking an ant is. If you're a sluggard, it's not a positive. This little insect works hard, and his challenge is you need to do the same. And so share with them that it should be natural to be diligent in our work, to get things done, to do a job. It's show them the positives of the result of being that way. And last, here's a third thing, and that they have to be challenged about their perspective and their priorities regarding life. You know, Matthew 22 tells us to love God and love our neighbors. A lazy person needs to be brought back to the reality that their relationship with God affects every other area of their life. That if I'm lazy, it affects the people around me. And so there are perspectives and priorities that are undermined when we're lazy. And we need to remind the lazy person of that. And last, just tell them this. If a lazy person is simply sitting around because they're lazy, we're not talking about the person that is consistently looking for a job if they don't have one. We're not even talking about the person who might have a job. There are people that you work with that are lazy. Somehow they keep their jobs for whatever the reason, but they're lazy. But a lazy person needs to be challenged, earn their keep. I mean, really, there's a lot of self-respect when you're a hard worker and you're doing what you need to do. Hey, well, this is Scott. Hopefully that helps us. Encourage the lazy person. Don't put them down. Don't attack them, but challenge them that what Scripture has to say is that God doesn't think that being lazy is a good thing. Just be productive in life. It'll be a lot easier on them as opposed to being lazy, and it just opens up a lot of opportunities. Have a great week. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.